The coronavirus pandemic and the protests over policing are laying bare the sharp economic divide between Black and white Americans. Here to talk about that is Danyelle Solomon, Vice President of Race and Ethnicity Policy at the Center for American Progress. Danyelle, good to see you this morning. Now, you've been speaking out on this for months now, that minority groups as a whole were less equipped financially to handle the pandemic. Where do we stand right now?
Yes, thank you for having me. You're absolutely right. COVID-19 is hitting communities of color much harder than their white counterparts. And it's beyond unfortunate, but it shouldn't be shocking to anyone. When we have any type of national emergency or pandemic, it not only spotlights inequality across the country, but it also exacerbates racial and ethnic disparities that have long been within our society, but have never been properly dealt with. And that's what we're seeing right now in the data.
And also, we're seeing a lot of companies take notice of Juneteenth, really for the first time ever. Companies like Nike and Twitter and Target actually saying that today is a company holiday. We see the mayor of New York City saying that next year, Juneteenth is going to be a citywide holiday and schools will be closed. It's a beginning, but what more would you want corporate America? What real steps should corporate America be taking to really bring diversity to the workplace?
That's a great question. Yes, these are all important steps. The monuments coming down, corporations making statements in solidarity, but we need to push further. We actually need to make structural changes to the way our economic, social, and civic systems work, so we have better outcomes for people of color. When we see high numbers of small business owners of color have to shutter their doors in the wake of COVID-19, that's not due to personal choices those small business owners made. That's due to the fact that it took them much longer and they probably had to spend a lot more time trying to get capital to open that door, and they're less likely to have wealth to weather a storm like this. We know before COVID-19 that there was stark wealth inequality. We know during COVID-19 that wealth inequality is only going to grow. 1/10 of wealth, which is what Black families have compared to white families, doesn't allow you to pull on any resources to weather this type of storm. So we need to ensure that we are putting forward not only public policy, but also corporations need to be thinking about, wages, equal pay, paid leave, all of these different types of policies to ensure that people of color have similar outcomes to their white counterparts.
Danyelle, what could be done quickly to close that financial divide? Sure, there's going to be things that may not be solved for many years, but what could be immediately done by policymakers to drive some of this change?
Yeah, that's again a great question. I mean, we talk about this in two buckets. I mean, the first bucket is like, what are the immediate things that policymakers can do in the wake of COVID-19? And we saw some of this happen, but more needs to be done. Unfortunately, the Senate will not take up the HEROES Act, and we need them to, because more money needs to get out the door to not only individuals, but again, business owners, so they can put food on the table and keep shelter. If you all aren't aware, the census has been collecting recent data, and if you look at the data, we find that renters of color are increasingly worried that the moratoriums that were put in place to ensure they weren't evicted, they're unsure if they're going to be able to pay their rent in the coming months. 45% of Black renters, 45% of Latinx renters are concerned that they won't have money to keep a roof over their head. So policymakers need to send more money out to people. In addition, they need to extend those moratoriums and work towards actually figuring out how to ensure people can pay their rent, right? We have a huge housing crisis in America. Longer term, we need to do some much bigger things. And one thing that we've been calling on is that policymakers, including whomever the next president is, take the racial wealth gap seriously and build a working group to actually come up with real, new economic, big, bold policy ideas that can not only shrink, but eliminate this gap. And that has to deal with not only wages, but also benefits. We know people of color, for example, are overrepresented in service sector jobs. Those are low-wage jobs that don't have quality benefits. So we have to change the way and re-envision the way our economic systems work.
Danyelle, with the time we have left, I would love your thoughts on President Trump's rally that's going to be held tomorrow in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was initially going to be held today on Juneteenth. There was an uproar about that because of the day of what Juneteenth represents and the fact that there was a 1921 race massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Some of his base already lining up to attend there. I believe the mayor there has set a curfew already, anticipating protests, hoping they don't turn violent. What kind of message do you think that sends to America and to African Americans specifically?
Well, honestly, when he first announced that he was going to Tulsa on Juneteenth, I took it as a complete slap in the face to Black Americans across the country. Not only is this day an important day for not only Black Americans, but really all Americans, that site that he wanted to have it on is also has a very strong meaning. That is the site where Black wealth was stripped, where over 300 African Americans were murdered, where businesses that they built on their own were bombed, and that wealth that they built on their own was stripped, and no accountability was really ever given to those families and those individuals. And for President Trump to go there and have his first rally there on that day and in that site without making any real efforts towards healing this country, being honest about systematic racism, is a slap in the face. And so while I'm glad that he took the advice from African Americans that he should move that day, he still fails to recognize the real issues facing America.
All right, let's leave it there. Danyelle Solomon, Vice President of Race and Ethnicity Policy at the Center for American Progress. Good to see you. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. You too.